as I mentioned last time, one of the strands of my research has been in evaluating these methods, and for this session I want to point out some of the ways that a corpus-based critical discourse analysis, or just a discourse analysis itself, can go wrong. So I don't want to kind of start off by saying I'm going to try to put you off from doing it, but instead I want to point out some of the potential pitfalls or traps that can occur when people do this. So these are hopefully things that you can bear in mind when you do it yourself. So in terms of the outline for today, I'm going to start by talking about problems to do with method. And then after that, I'll move on to look at problems relating to interpreting or evaluating the results. And then I'll end by referring to some useful principles, things that I found helpful, that maybe make us avoid getting into some of these traps. So to start off, I'm going to look at some issues surrounding methods, and I'll start with searching and finding things. So this involves when you're using a corpus tool, something like Wordsmith or Sketch Engine or AntConc or WMatrix, and there's usually a box, a search box, and you type in something, a word or a phrase or a combination of word and tag, and you can get a concordance up and then go on to look for collocates. And I think there's a kind of issue that maybe we don't acknowledge as much, and that some things are a lot easier to search for than others, and that can maybe send us down certain paths and make us do certain types of analysis, which may be the easier ones. So it's kind of very easy to type in a word, that's fine, or maybe a phrase or something like that. And we can use wildcards as well, you may have seen that already, so the star, you can use that, stands for any character. But what if you want to say, look for something which is a bit more variable, a feature of language, or maybe is a bit longer? So what if somebody says, I want to find all the metaphors in a corpus. I'm really interested in metaphor, and I think something really exciting is happening with metaphor in my data, my corpus. So show me the metaphors. I want a concordance of them all. How do you do it? How do you get that? It's really hard. Another thing, and I had this actually, somebody came to me and said, Paul, we've tried to do corpus-based discourse analysis, and we asked the corpus to show us where all the disagreements were in the corpus. And it wouldn't, and it's not working for us. What do we do? And I said, well, it won't. It's not going to do that. It's really hard. So how do you get around this? And I think a lot of people just kind of think, well, I won't bother. I'll do something else instead, which takes us off onto a different type of analysis. There are ways, I think, around it, if you may be a bit more intrepid and dogged and motivated to get to some of these things. So there is corpus research and metaphor going on at the moment, people like Charteris Black. One person has suggested with metaphor that sometimes you can identify metaphors by two words that have very different semantic groups occurring together quite a lot. So one way maybe to spot these would be to semantically tag all of your corpus and then look for collocates of semantic tags that seem to be a bit out of whack, which you wouldn't maybe expect to find, and maybe they're going to point you to metaphor. With disagreements, you might be lucky in that somebody might have gone through your corpus in advance for you and tagged all the disagreements, and so it's just a case of saying, show me them all, and up they all pop. And that sometimes does happen, but not very often. And if it's a new corpus that you've just built, you're going to have to do it yourself. Maybe just read through the corpus. One thing I've tried to do myself, I've done some research looking at disagreements on spoken data. And it's kind of helpful. You can start maybe thinking about the sorts of words maybe that, or phrases that would have disagreements in them. So things like no, for example, or I don't think so, or not really, or things like that. And you could maybe do concordant searches on those. And if it's a small enough corpus, it might be quite helpful to look at those things. I looked at all of the female speech recently in the MyCase corpus, which is a corpus of academic English, so classroom interactions, seminars, things like that. And I was particularly looking at how women disagree within such situations. And first of all, I thought, well, I'll try and do it via concordance. So I just typed in lots of these phrases like, I'm not sure, I don't think so, you're wrong, things like that, that's not right. And then I read the whole corpus as a separate thing, all the way through. I read every single file and noted them all by hand. And I got 100 altogether when I read it all the way through, but I only got 94 of them when I used these corpus techniques, so I missed 6. And the 6 that I missed, I think would have been impossible really to have actually guessed the search that would have actually brought them up. They were quite subtle and implicit, and I'm not really sure I would have found them in any other way. And some people might say, well, okay, 94 out of 100 is quite good, maybe that's good, but the 6 were actually really interesting, and it's kind of one of those things where I just couldn't get them, and I had to kind of hold my hands up and say it didn't work as well as I would have liked it to. And I think sometimes you do just have to admit that and say, this is very good, this method is very good at doing some certain things, it's not so good at doing others. But is it good enough for what I want to do? Another issue I think involves finding features that just aren't there at all. And there are two kind of ways I want to think about this. One involves things like linguistic features, things like, say, a bare infinitive. So this would be a case where someone says, rather than saying, I helped him to get ready, they say, I helped him get ready. So they miss that word to out. It's kind of called a bare infinitive. And how do you find that when someone's not doing something in a corpus, as opposed to when they are doing something? It's quite hard to do. Another one's a zero article. So things like, I went to hospital. So we're not using an article with the word hospital here. We're sort of missing it off. And how do you find cases like that if you're interested? Sometimes some people have kind of developed complex sequences of grammatical tags in order to kind of spot some of these, which can be quite useful and get most of them. But again, we're maybe not sure we're going to get all of them. Maybe looking at a sample is another option. I think McHenry and Shao, when they looked at bare infinitives, they looked at all of the verb forms of the word help in a corpus, and they looked at concordance lines of each one, and then they just marked by hand which ones have the bare infinitive, which ones have the full infinitive. So they did it by hand as a sample. And obviously that's just one word. It's just telling us about help. It's not telling us about every single verb that exists, but it's, you know, maybe it's representative of some of the bigger picture. Another problem, particularly relating to when we want to do discourse analysis, is in identifying when a discourse could have occurred around a topic in a corpus, but it's just not in your corpus. So instead, what you do maybe is, if you're good, you spot the minority discourses. So maybe you have this majority pattern, which you get from looking at collocates, and then you look at all the concordance lines, and you say, there's a minority going on here. Maybe once or twice somebody is kind of having this very resistant position. So I'll talk about that as the minority position. But what if they just never say it? What if that never ever comes up in your data? And so you've missed it, and you don't even know you've missed it because you weren't even aware of it. To give an example for myself, where I kind of got quite a bit embarrassed. A few years ago, I was looking at a corpus of newspaper articles about asylum seekers. And I'd noticed that words which collocated with asylum seekers often related to authenticity, words like false or genuine or bogus. Words like we looked at on Wednesday when we looked at refugees, and they came up, and there were similar sorts of words. So we thought, we'll step outside our corpus. We went to like official documentation on asylum seeking. And we found out that in the UK, it's a process where everyone's allowed to claim asylum. They go through this process, and everyone who comes to the UK is allowed to do it. And then a decision gets made about them. It's a bit like taking a test, and you either pass it or you fail it. If you fail it, you call it a failed asylum seeker, and then you're sent home eventually. Terrible. But everyone is allowed to take it. So to call someone a bogus asylum seeker is wrong. It's sort of semantically wrong, because it's saying like you're a bogus exam taker or you're a bogus job applicant. Everyone's allowed to apply for a job. You may not get it, but at least you're allowed to take it. So we got quite excited about this. We thought we've spotted something with this phrase, bogus asylum seekers, and it's used so much in the news, but it's kind of messing with people's heads. It's kind of telling them something that doesn't really exist. So I gave this talk about this to a group of people who were very interested in immigration. And at the end of my talk, one woman said, well, that's very interesting, Paul, but haven't you really questioned the idea that maybe asylum shouldn't exist at all? You're kind of sticking in the rules here. And maybe what's more important that you've missed is that maybe asylum is wrong. Maybe the whole process of applying for asylum is wrong, and it's not fair, and we should just get rid of it altogether. And why haven't you talked about that in your corpus? And I said, well, it wasn't in my corpus. No one said that in the newspaper. They talked about bogus asylum seekers, or they didn't. But no one in the newspaper questioned whether asylum should actually exist as that process. And I hadn't thought of it. So she was saying, let's get rid of all the borders and let people go where they want to. And whether you agree with that is another issue altogether. That's another talk. But my point I'm trying to make is that I hadn't thought of something, and I kind of focused what was in the data, and then somebody else kind of heard it, and they weren't really very happy because I'd missed on what they felt was a really, really important thing. So bear in mind, the corpus can only show its own content, and if you stay within that, you're going to be kind of restrained by that as well. So sometimes it's useful to talk to other people, even if they tell you something which is quite surprising and you haven't thought of yourself. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to talk about another kind of problem which is to do with the application of cutoffs. and how we use these to get results or to limit the amount of results we get. So as you've hopefully seen over the last few sessions, so if you do keywords analysis, we have to be quite specific about how many keywords we want to get, and we say, I'm going to go to the top 10 keywords or a p-value of so much, and then the rest of them I'll just throw away. I won't bother looking at those. And the same thing applies to collocates. We specify what the statistical significance needs to be, or their MI value for collocation. We also have a cutoff to do maybe with the span. So do we look at 5 words either side of our node word, or 3 words, or 10 words, or how much? And you know, people use these cutoffs in very different ways. There's no standard about how we decide what a cutoff should be. So we have to make our own decisions, really. And sometimes we can sort of do a bit of a cop-out. We can say, well, Susan Hunston says that 3 is the statistical significance point, so I'm going to go with Susan because I trust her, and that's fine. But some people say, well, no, maybe it shouldn't be 3, maybe it should be 8 or something like that. I've got an example here about span and how we can change the span, and that can really impact on what the cutoffs we get. So look at these 2 sentences. These are from the BNC. And imagine I'm interested in collocates of man here. I'm looking at gendered discourses. So imagine I'm setting my span at 3, just 3 words either side of man. Now that's going to miss that first one. In Vienna there was a man called Schultz who was a kind of genius. Now I think genius is a really interesting collocate here, potentially. You know, men as geniuses. Interesting to see if women get described as geniuses. They don't as much as men. But if I had my span at just 3, it's going to miss that word genius because it occurs, I think it's 8 words away from the word man, even though it's quite a relevant one. So maybe I'll change my span. Imagine I have it maybe as 5 instead. And then look at the next sentence. We've got a dreadful van from a man called Nick the Maltese down the East End. Now here the word dreadful is going to come up as a collocate of man, but actually it's not really modifying man, it's modifying the van. And you may say there's a kind of guilt by association there, because it's the man's van who's dreadful, but it's not the man who's being called dreadful, it's his van. So there's a problem here in terms of how we apply cutoffs and what they potentially can give us. Now I think the last example, that's maybe, if that comes up in our list of collocates, we at least have a chance to spot that, because we can go to a concordance of dreadful and man in the same line, and we can look down it, and we can go, you know, in this case, dreadful actually is not modifying man, it's doing something a bit different. I'll throw it away, or I'll put it in a footnote, or I'll do something with it, but at least I'm aware of it. With that top one, we're going to miss genius altogether. It's kind of not even there for us to be aware that we missed it. We don't even know we've missed a case like this, and that's really hard, I think, to correct. And this may actually present an argument maybe for having quite big spans, because at least then you get everything in, and even if some of it's rubbish, you can throw it away. Whereas if you have small spans, you're missing stuff maybe, and you don't even know what you're missing. Okay, a related issue about changing these spans relates kind of in a much more general sense to the fact that when we do this type of analysis, there's no set way of doing it. Instead, what we've got is a kind of collection of methods or procedures that we can use, and we can do them in any order we want to. We can do some and not others. It's really very much up to us. And that kind of worries me, or it has worried me in the past. About 3 years ago, I thought, I'm going to test this out. I'm going to actually see what happens when you get the same people to do the same analysis, or you give them the same data. Do they actually come up with the same results if you say do a corpus analysis? Or do they come up with really, really different things? Because we're kind of arguing that this is a very objective way of doing analysis. You get rid of all of this, you know, researcher bias, the computers are not biased, so we should all really get the same results when we do this. So I got 5 people who I knew, and I said, please will you do some analysis for me? They said yes. And they'd all done some of this analysis before, so they kind of knew what they were doing. They were at least up to PhD level. So I gave them a small corpus of news articles about foreign doctors, which I was quite interested in myself. And I said, there you are, there's the corpus, you've got a month, could you analyse it, tell me what the discourses around foreign doctors are, and then write up a short report for me, and then give it back. So they all did that. They gave me the reports, and then I looked at the 5 reports, and kind of tried to see what is it they did? Did they do the same things? And what did they find? Did they find the same things? And these are my kind of summary, a very short summary of the findings. This is coming out as a paper, it's in press at the moment. First of all, it was kind of a bit, well, maybe not so unexpected. They all did something different with their analysis. One person looked at collocates of the phrase foreign doctor. One person looked at all the keywords in the corpus using a reference corpus. Somebody else looked at concordance lines with the phrase. So they all did different things. So okay, they did different things. Did they get the same results? Well, about a quarter of the findings were uncovered by the majority of the analysts, so at least 3 out of the 5 of them actually found, the majority of things, the quarter of these things. So within the corpus, and it was quite a kind of predictable corpus in a way, there were lots of kind of very similar stories about foreign doctors as being bad. They can't speak English properly, they don't know what they're doing, they're incompetent, they kill people, they need to be regulated better. The government needs to come in and test their language or get rid of them, throw them out if they can't speak English. And that was everywhere in the corpus. And so it wasn't really that surprising that this very majority finding was found by everybody. Everybody spotted those things, pretty much. But there are a lot of much smaller kind of findings, which maybe only occurred in 1 or 2 files or 1 or 2 articles. And generally, most people didn't spot those. About 2/3 of the smaller findings were only really spotted by 1 person out of the 5. So, for example, there was one analyst said that it's really interesting that I'm seeing that foreign doctors are represented in terms of invasion metaphors. They're kind of being parachuted into Britain. Foreign doctors are invading Britain. And they were often related to stories about German foreign doctors who killed people. And they'd often talk about these people who'd been in World War II. They'd survived World War II. All these Germans had tried to kill them in World War II, they'd survived. And then they have this German foreign doctor who comes in years later and then kills them because they're incompetent. And those were the sorts of kind of German invasion metaphor, and it sort of was kind of implicit in some of these, which was quite interesting, but only 1 person spotted that because it wasn't that common. So they got the main things, but they kind of differed in terms of the smaller things. Not everybody spotted the smaller things. I also looked at the different types of methods that people did, and I thought, well, some of these reports have lots of findings in them. They're quite productive in terms of what they've got. Some of them actually don't seem to have as many findings. So I looked at the 2 reports which had the most stuff in, the most findings, the most productive. And I thought, well, what did they do? Did they do the same thing? Or did they do something else? And actually, they did different things, totally different strategies. One person just did one thing, but they kind of did it in a really kind of obsessive, kind of careful, thorough, rigorous way. So they got a concordance of the phrase foreign doctors, and they went through every single one, line by line by line by line, and read the paragraph or maybe the full text. And then they categorized each one in terms of what was happening. So very thorough. Second person didn't really do anything that thorough, but they just did a lot of different things. So they tagged everything with W matrix. They looked at keywords, they looked at collocates, they looked at concordances. They just threw everything they had at this data, and then they ended up getting a lot of stuff out of it. So potentially 2 ways to do something well, maybe. Do one thing really well, or do lots of things all at once. So I think the experiments that I did suggest that there is going to be some variability in the results, and we can't get away from that. The computers are not biased, we are biased, I think, and whatever we do, we're going to do something differently because there's no set way of doing it. But at least it's a bit encouraging that everybody got the main picture, I think, from the result, from whatever they did, they came out with the main thing. So I wasn't too upset, but I was maybe, at first I was quite upset when I did this. Okay, let's move on. I think another thing we need to be very careful about overstating is this claim that we're going to be completely objective and that a corpus approach to discourse analysis takes cherry picking away altogether. And I talked about cherry picking on Wednesday. I said that a criticism of CDA done traditionally is that people could just take these 1 or 2 texts and say, that proves my point that everyone's homophobic or sexist. But they ignore all of the hundreds of other texts where they're not. And I thought, well, actually, does corpus analysis actually remove the cherry picking altogether? So I thought I'd actually use myself as a kind of as a subject to analyse. I'd be quite reflexive. And I thought I'll go back to some of my other studies that I've done, and I'll think, did I cherry pick at all? Try and think about it. Be honest with yourself. To what extent did you actually do any cherry picking? Was I exhaustive in terms of looking at all the keywords that I actually found? Or did I think, that's an interesting one, I'll have that, but I won't bother with those 100 other keywords? So I looked at keyword studies, and I looked at 6 ones that I'd had published over the last 10 years or so, and I thought I'd look at what I actually did, how many keywords I got, and how many I actually looked at, and what the reasons were that I had for choosing certain ones if I did choose. So of these 6 studies, there was quite a bit of variability. One of them, I only got 22 keywords to look at, and I looked at most of them. Another one was this enormous study that came out as a book. It was comparing this enormous sort of 10-year corpus of newspaper articles. And we got 1,500 keywords. And then out of those ones, I looked at which ones did I actually write about. So which ones did I mention in my analysis bits of my write-up. And again, a lot of variability. Between 16% were mentioned and 86% were actually subjected to some sort of analysis of the ones that I got. And I think obviously this is very much going to depend on how many keywords you start off with and very kind of real-world constraints upon you, such as, if you're writing a journal article or a book chapter, I had one recently and I said you have 6,000 words to write an analysis which demonstrates how to do this type of analysis. And I thought, well, once you've done all your referencing and literature review and your theory, and you describe your data and your method, you've maybe got about 3,000 words to write it up. What can you actually say? You've got to cherry pick in some ways, even if you've looked at a lot, because you're going to go over your word count otherwise. And even with the book that I wrote, which gave me 100,000 words, it was still really hard to look at all these keywords anyway. So we are going to cherry pick. We have to, I think. There's no other way about it. So then I thought about, well, okay, what reasons do I have? How can I justify my cherry picking in a sense? Is it as bad as as the people who do CDA can be accused of doing? And I looked at the keywords I chose. I looked at the ones I didn't choose. I tried to remember back to what was happening in my mind when I was sort of sitting with my data in front of me, and which ones I picked and which ones I didn't. And there were lots of different reasons. I think some of them I picked because they just seemed really relevant to the research questions that I had. So I tended to focus on those. Some I picked because they seemed like really easy wins, in a sense. I saw a word and I thought, I know why that word's a keyword, and I know that it's a nasty word, it's doing something unpleasant, and I can talk about this and prove my point. So yeah, I cherry-picked it. Although on the other hand, some I picked because I had no idea why they were in there. I thought, I don't even know what this word means, let alone why it's in the corpus. It's a kind of, it's a really complicated word. I've never heard it before. So I went to some of those just because I didn't understand why they were in there. Some of the words I didn't use because they had very similar functions to a word I'd already looked at. And I thought, if I mention this word, I'm just repeating myself, and people are going to get bored with me. So I'll just kind of talk about the first one, and I'll say, these are the words kind of have a similar function, let's move on to the next bit. So I kind of did that too, and that was a way of kind of limiting the amount of repetition and allowing me to talk about a wider range of things. So I think what I'd say is that, yeah, we do cherry pick, but I think we have to maybe justify our decisions, and if we try to pick a range of different types of words, some which we're familiar with, some which we're not, we try to avoid repetition. At least I think we're kind of starting from a basis where we're being a little bit more objective. And the fact that there are these keywords anyway has removed one level of cherry picking from the analysis to begin with. We have to explain why these particular words are here, and they're all keywords for a reason.